Good morning.
Good morning.
We're really excited to have you all here today. As you know, normally I go off script and just ad lib, but this is an important enough event that Holly reined me in and gave me words to say, so I'm going to read a little bit more than I normally do. We're joined today by supporters of the center, including Judy Flom. Big round of applause. Martha Minow, who'll be joining us shortly. Einar Elhaig, the founding faculty director of the center. Fellowship alumni, visitors, students, distinguished HLS alumni who've been involved with the center over the years. We really couldn't ask for a better gathering of people to put this together. I assume most of you in the audience know a bit about Petrie Flom already, but just in case, we're one of the leading research programs at any law school dedicated to the unbiased legal and ethical analysis of pressing questions facing health policymakers, medical professionals, patients, families, and others who influence and are influenced by the healthcare system. We organize events like this one, publish a widely read blog called Bill of Health, co-produce the peer-reviewed Journal of Law and the Biosciences, run various fellowship programs, conduct sponsored research, produce independent scholarship on a range of topics under the umbrellas of health law, biotechnology, and bioethics. You have lots of information in the center in your conference materials, and if you don't know us well yet, we hope you'll say hello and let us tell you a little bit about ourselves. This is a celebration of the 10th anniversary of the center, the 10th anniversary year, and the generous gifts establishing the center in 2005 from Joe Flom and the Carol and Milton Petrie Foundation. It's a particular honor to be on this dais together because Holly and I were part of the inaugural fellowship class in 2006, picked with, I want to say, exquisite judgment and taste by Einar Elhaig, right? So we're really glad to be here and to say that we've been part of this organization from the very beginning and to see it grow and to see it change and to be excited about the next 10 years ahead of us. We'll spend some time this morning celebrating Joe Flom's vision, what we've accomplished so far, and where we're headed over the next decade. You take over.
Great.
This is like the Oscars, except there's no,
Oscars
jokes.
music,
Yeah,
right.
Go ahead.
So what better way to celebrate our mission of interdisciplinary analysis and health law policy, biotechnology, and bioethics than to have a day of robust discussion with leading experts on the future of health law policy. And that's really what we're going to be doing for most of the day today. So the bulk of what we'll talk about today will be spent on panel discussions focused on healthcare coverage, costs and fragmentation, law and bioethics, health innovation policy and regulating novel technology, and empirical health law. We're also thrilled to be joined by Alan Weil, who's editor-in-chief of Health Affairs. Later this afternoon, he'll be giving a keynote presentation over lunch. And so with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Einar Elhaig. He is the Carol and Milton Petrie Professor of Law here at Harvard Law School and the founding faculty director of the center, and he'll be saying a few words this morning about his founding vision for the center.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for attending. The Petrie Flom Center really exists today because of the vision of Joe Flom, as well as the generosity of him and the Petrie Foundation. And when I say it exists because of the vision of Joe Flom, I mean much more than in the usual sense. Joe was actually trying to donate a major amount of money to Harvard for years to build such a center, and we actually kept turning him down for years. Now, we did it for the best of reasons, which was that Harvard was not yet sure that it had a good plan to use such a major donation effectively in a way that fit Harvard's mission and for which we had enough faculty support. And I think that's really actually one of the great things about Harvard, that even if somebody wants to give you a huge amount of money, we're not going to even take it unless we can make sure we can use it wisely in a way that fits our educational mission. So eventually, under the leadership of then Dean Elena Kagan, we figured out a plan. She gathered a lot of faculty together and said, surely we can think of something useful to do with a fair amount of money in this important area. So we did, and it had three main pillars. One is that we realized part of the trouble with FIT is we didn't have enough faculty interested in issues of health law policy and bioethics. So one of the first aims was, well, let's create more faculty who are interested in this area by creating an academic fellowship to fund scholars in the early years. I'm an antitrust guy in my other hat. So one thing I can say is health law has large entry barriers. There's a huge amount of technical knowledge you need. And so anything we can do to lower those entry barriers into health law scholarship is beneficial. So when we began, I would say there was a relative shortage not only here at Harvard, but elsewhere. And so the idea was that if we could jumpstart it with these academic fellowships, we could not only get some good health law scholars here at Harvard, but also seed the rest of the legal academy. I remember the first years, we sent out all these calls. I wasn't sure what would come back. And then there turned out to be a lot of pent-up demand because there was tons and tons of applications, two of which are the superstars you see before you today, Glenn Cohen and Holly Lynch, but a bunch of others as well. And I think the program ended up being remarkably successful. Not only do we benefit from Glenn and Holly, but we now today can say that we've placed professors from our academic fellowship at Berkeley, MIT, Michigan, Texas, UCLA, Northwestern, BU, the University of Cambridge, University of Arizona, Maryland, and the Washington University in St. Louis. So it's been quite remarkable. The second pillar that we were focused on was to have a student fellowship, because we thought it was very important to engage students in the work of the center, both to aid in their development as possible scholars themselves, but also because many students wanted to learn more about the intricacies of health law in order to be practitioners, policymakers, lawmakers in the future. They've done a myriad of things I can't possibly describe, because I'm proud to say we've now had 73 student fellows at this center. The third major pillar that we had is we wanted to make Harvard Law School an area of lively intellectual interchange about health law policy, bioethics, and biotechnology. To do that, we created this health law policy and bioethics workshop that would feature cutting-edge scholarship in the field and serve really as a centerpiece for both the academic fellowship and the student fellowship. And today we have not only that workshop, but a myriad of lectures and conferences. You're probably all on the email list. I can't even keep up with them all anymore. There's so much going on. It's become a really exciting place for health law policy discussion here. So frankly, I think it all worked out much better than I could have hoped 10 years ago. And I think one of the successful things we did is when I started the center, an aspiration that I had was to not make it dependent on particular individuals, but rather to try to create some sort of institutional culture that would be not only self-perpetuating, but constantly self-generating in terms of figuring out new ways to drive the center in new and exciting directions. So today, I think, with the terrific and highly energetic leadership of Glenn and Holly, the center not only does everything I originally set out to do, but far more. Today we've got an academic journal on bioethics. We've got this very prominent Bill of Health blog. We have a series of books on health law policy, and huge research projects like the football players' health study, the project on law and neuroscience, and many, many more. So I myself could not be prouder of where they have taken the center, and I can't wait to see what the next 10 years bring. So let me now introduce our benefactor and friend of the center, Judy Sorensen Flom. Judy is a philanthropist and a founding member of the center's advisory board, and she's actually closely involved not only with this center, but with the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior in Mass General and at other centers as well. It's really people like Judy who make centers like this possible. So please give it up for Judy Sorensen Flom.
Good morning. It is such an honor to be here. As you heard, I'm Judy Flom, and I'm here to talk to you about my dear husband, Joe. With our friends Milton and Carol Petrie, Joe was a founding supporter of the Petrie Flom Center. First, I want to thank Dean Martha Minow and Professor Glenn Cohen for asking me to speak at this 10th anniversary celebration. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to share both this moment of reflection and to tell you about Joe's vision and hopes for the Petrie Flom Center. A little about Joe's vision. You've no doubt heard the phrase, all politics is local. Well, I would suggest that all philanthropy is personal. And Joe's journey is the perfect example of that. His desire and ability to make life better for other people was a product of three things: love of the law, extraordinary talent, and his personal story. Understanding these elements will illustrate why he had such a fervent belief in the mission of the Petrie Flom Center and why it sits at Harvard Law School. Let's start with Joe's love of the law. As many of you know, from a very young age, Joe had a burning desire to go to Harvard Law School. However, this aspiration was somewhat improbable. Joe grew up in poverty in a Brooklyn tenement, and in addition to attending school, he always had odd jobs so he could help support himself, his parents, and his sister. When it became time for him to go to college, Joe's excellent grades and some of the money he had managed to earn and save, including at a law firm, enabled him to attend the City College of New York at night. He attended for only 2 years because World War II broke out, and he signed up for the Navy. As Joe's luck would have it, he was able to serve stateside because he was colorblind. After Joe's stint in the service, he returned to Brooklyn and moved back into his parents' apartment. That didn't last long, however, because Joe knew it was finally time to become a lawyer. So, undaunted by the fact he didn't have a college degree, he applied at Harvard Law School. To Joe's enormous surprise, he was rejected. However, never one to take no for an answer, he wrote to the school. Joe's letter basically said that he should be accepted at Harvard Law School because he was the best thing since sliced bread. Well, that was quite a letter because the school contacted Joe and invited him to Cambridge for an interview. And that must have been quite an interview because Joe was accepted, provided he could be there to begin his studies the very next day. So, with his usual determination and stamina, Joe immediately returned to Brooklyn, packed his bags, and said goodbye to his family. And without any place to live in Cambridge, he hurriedly returned and began his studies the very next day. The rest is Joe Flom history. Joe's graduation from Harvard Law School at the top of his class, Joe's inability to get a job at any of the best law firms in New York City because of the then prejudice against Jews, and Joe's tenacity to overcome that by joining a couple of other lawyers to create one of the biggest and best law firms in the world. You see, Joe was an outsider, and in this society, the law is the one instrument that can alter the status quo. In the right hands, it can look underneath structures which actually shore up systemic inequality. Sometimes that inequality is because of inertia or ulterior motive, even good intentions gone wrong. But whatever the reason, Joe understood that in this great country of laws, those who mastered them could change the world. And that's what he set out to do and did. So love of the law was ingredient one. Now comes his own unique talent. Some of you may have read Malcolm Gladwell's book, his chapter on Joe, in The Outliers. Or you may just know that Joe and his Skadden Arps colleagues revolutionized the landscape of corporate law. They were the ultimate outsiders. But they empowered shareholders and entrepreneurs by challenging the structure of old-time corporate boards. Joe was determined to level this playing field, and he did it through vital access to shareholders, board meetings, and to the books. When smart young lawyers could question the supposedly neutral rules propping up a self-serving order, shareholders could demand accountability. As a result, the modern proxy battle was born. So Joe loved the law and its ability to redress systemic wrongs. As we've seen, his special talent was using his status as a legal outsider to confront entrenched corporate power. Now, the third ingredient is Joe's personal narrative, which is why he targeted the imperfections of healthcare. When Joe was the only associate in the firm, which became Skadden Arps, he and his first wife, Claire, were blessed with their first child, Peter. Unfortunately, early on it became clear that Peter struggled with some basic cognitive skills. For instance, processing nonverbal cues, such as the tone of someone's voice or the meaning of a facial expression. There was also difficulty with special relationships and time sequences. Peter was turned down at nursery school, and a psychologist predicted that he would never go to college. The doctors offered no treatment options. Peter was simply consigned to staying home. This was totally unacceptable to Joe and Claire. So in response, they started their own school for children with learning disabilities. They used most of Joe's $300 a month salary to help start that school. And 50 years later, Gateway is a premier, independent, nationally recognized school serving over 140 special needs students. And Peter, the boy who was rebuffed from nursery school, has 2 master's degrees, a PhD, and his own consulting firm in New York City. Looking back, it's not at all surprising that Joe's belief in the equalizing power of law, essential requirement for fairness, and his personal experience with the medical establishment made creation of the Petrie Flom Center an imperative. Joe could not accept in this society the lack of a basic human need, health care. And he certainly could not abide well-intentioned physicians and policymakers causing bad outcomes. Joe knew that Harvard Law School had to be at the forefront of redressing these problems, offering smart and fair solutions to the complexities of care and suffering. Since 2005, the Petrie Flom Center has indeed tackled these and so many other fundamental problems. The starting five, Ina Elheg, William Fisher, Charles Nesson, Alan Stone, and of course Martha Minow, were a formidable team. The center put healthcare reform and economics first on its agenda 7 full years before Congress passed the Affordable Care Act. And Petrie Flom identified lapses in pharmaceutical regulation long before Martin Shkreli became a household name. As for our future, here are just a few difficult problems to disentangle. We must recognize the outwardly innocuous structures that do harm, often with the best intentions. Determine if health care is really distributed equally, regardless of race, income, and personal attributes. Decide whether the FDA protects consumers or is a captive of the industry it oversees. Find a way to reconcile religion and insurance. Balance reproductive rights with endorsements of family values. Establish if gun control is a public health issue or a Second Amendment issue. If Joe were here, he might give this advice. Look at the aspirations and then face the reality. Somewhere in that great divide, you will find your challenges and your opportunities. Thank you.
Thank Judy very much for those remarks. I got to say, when you read about Joe Flom, you might think it's fiction, right? This man who lived this amazing life, and I highly, in particular, recommend the chapter in Outliers devoted to him. But having met the man and missing him very much, absolutely 100% fact. But fact, a life of fact lived as fiction. It's my pleasure now to introduce our dean, the Helen and Morgan Shue Professor of Law, and Dean Martha Minow. Dean Minow, I've kind of lost count. I think it's over 14 books now. I've sort of lost count over time. But Dean Minow is the author of more than 14 books. She serves as the vice chair of the Legal Services Corporation, appointed by President Obama. She served on the board of the MacArthur Foundation, and 100 other honors, a little too numerous to mention. And we're really excited to have Dean Minow here because she, too, is part of the team that brought us the center, in addition to her wonderful support all of these years. So, Martha, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, everybody. This is pretty exciting. I was indeed lucky enough to be in some rooms talking about, could there be a center at Harvard that addresses, and then we had a kind of interesting discussion. What was the thing it was going to address? Well, that's why there's a long title. Health and bioethics and biotechnology all were animating this idea. And Judy, it's just such a delight and thrilled and honor to be here with you. I was privileged enough to know Joe and to be challenged by him. He would always ask, what's the big idea? What's something that nobody else is doing? What could we do that would actually solve a problem, that would be cutting edge? And that's why he's such a perfect exemplar for Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Outliers. Judy did a wonderful job outlining both not only Joe's vision, but also a vision for the future here, and I'm very grateful to you for that. Einar, you created the ecosystem. You created the structure that has produced more than any of us could have imagined. And for that, I will always be an admirer, as well as so many other aspects of your own work that you have done in this field and in others. And then the dynamic duo of Glenn and Holly. I can't keep up with all of your work. Let me just say that everything that I say from now on until I step down is because I learned it from them. So when I look at the list of topics that are currently on the agenda for this amazing center, that range from the Affordable Care Act and animal research, biobanking, biospecimen research, all the way to gene patenting, the human subjects research, neuroscience and the law, vaccines. I think about really 3 different ways to organize the work here. The first is to think hard about subject matter. The second is to think about mediums of work, and the third is to think about roles in the world. So when we think about subject matters, I think rightly so, at the core of this center has always been the issues of health policy as they relate not only to the provision of health care, but also to relevant research and to the emerging issues posed by technology and its opportunities. I think that, therefore, we expected that there would be continuing discussions about healthcare research. I think we didn't know how many Supreme Court decisions that would generate. I think that we expected there would be discussions about pharmaceutical regulation and access. I don't think that we expected that there would be so many issues that related to religion coming from that field. Same with vaccines. And another subject area, I think that we knew there would be work about brain science. I don't think we had any idea how explosive and transformative it would be. And it's wonderful to see the relationship between this center and other groups, such as the brain effort that Judy herself is involved in. I think that the bioethics issues, again, we anticipated, but I think we tended to assume it would be doctor-patient, and we didn't fully understand the changing, multiplying actors in healthcare provision that not only include all the human beings, but also the electronic forms of healthcare provision and the ethical issues that are posed by algorithms and privacy. And I think we can say about biotech. I think we knew that genetic research was going to make a difference. I don't think we knew the impact fully of how plotting out the human genome would have implications, not only for research, but for human health. Here are some topics I think that we didn't fully anticipate. Food. You know, we knew food and drug would be important, but food itself, access to safe, secure, reliable food. We just held a conference over the weekend here. 300 people came to talk together about the relationship between land and access to health and safety in food. And I really give enormous credit to students who are at the center of that activity, but it's part of the ecosystem of this amazing center and hugely boosted by the work of the clinics. And I see Robert Greenwald, who will be talking later, who helped to foster that context so beautifully. I think we knew that there would be international dimensions, but I don't think we knew we would be talking about the kinds of work that Glenn and Holly have made so much a center of their work, you know, patients with passports, and issues really about bioethics cross-culturally. I think that a twist that Judy implied that will be very important going forward is equality and quality of health and healthcare from a global perspective. How can equality and quality be advanced? That, I think, is a puzzle of the tallest order. And another topic, again, that Judy helped to frame is what do public health approaches offer to areas that we haven't in the past thought of in public health terms? Certainly gun safety is an example of that. The same could be said about terrorism and violence of all sorts, issues about bullying, issues about really what are the emotional health issues that we are facing in a very complicated world. Second area, second kind of topic, though, is not just subject matter topics, it's medium. I think that research is at the core of what the center does, and rightly so. I think that the belief in the Enlightenment Project, despite what may be going on in the world, remains firm here, that advancing knowledge, asking good questions, sharing information can make the world better. But I also think that we have learned that being a cross-disciplinary form of research is also absolutely crucial, and that's why, to me, it's so heartening to see the tremendous work of the edited volumes and the journals that really cross borders. In addition, though, I think public education and another medium that has been so central, and here I do give so much credit to Einar, has been growing the next generation of leaders, creating a context in which a new generation can ask questions that we oldsters didn't even imagine. It's therefore just especially thrilling and sweet to see Glenn as one of those once upon a time still young, next generation leaders at the helm right here. And the multiple generations now of fellows who have gone on to do just spectacular work, again, broadening the frontiers. But beyond subject matters and media of our work, I do think that there's a very important question about role. And I think that, it's always somewhat arrogant for an academic to say, well, we have a center, like you're the center of the universe, like how many Harvard professors or students does it take to change a light bulb? Just one, because we think the world revolves around us. But I do think that really, if we were going to rename it, we might call it Bridge. Because I think that what has been, in my view, the greatest accomplishment of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics is the creation of a bridge within Harvard University across to the medical school and the public health school and the economics department and so forth, and beyond to the medical profession and its great journals, to the political world, to people who think hard about patents and the patenting of the gene. And I think that kind of bridge work is essential and will be, for the next 10 years, if not beyond, even more important. And in this respect, I will close by just returning to the lessons that we have from Joe Flom, which is that how important it is to continue to look from the outside and to ask what's cutting edge and what's a new question and a new answer. How can we create something that will enable other people to make a difference? And therefore, it's just for me a great delight and an honor to be here, and I can't wait to hear about all of the great ideas on the deck for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha and Judy and Einar. I spend my life doing the nitty-gritty work of the center on a day-to-day basis, so it's really thrilling to hear more about the vision for the center and what it was hoped that we would accomplish and what we're working to accomplish every day. I'm now going to share a short video with alumni reflections on the center. You'll see many of these people during the panels today, but we've asked many of our alumni to talk about the center's role in the world and their role, the center's role in developing their careers.
I'm Einar Elhaig, and I'm the founding director of the Petrie-Flom Center.
I'm Katie Crashall. I was a student fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center in the 2011-2012 academic year. I currently work as Associate General Counsel at Yale New Haven Health System, which is part of the large academic medical center for Yale University.
Hi, I'm Neil Shah. I'm an obstetrician and an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School.
My name is Allison Hoffman. I was an academic fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center from 2008 until 2010. And after my time at the Petrie-Flom Center, I began a career as an assistant professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and I'm now a tenured member of law school faculty there.
My name is Timo Minzen. I come originally from Germany, but I'm now professor of biotechnology and innovation law at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark and guest lecturer at Lund University in Sweden.
My name is Christopher Robertson. I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona and also a professor here.
My name is Kathy Zeiler. I'm a professor of law at Boston University. I was first involved with Harvard's Petrie Flom Center when I visited at the law school in 2008. In 2010, the center invited me to act as a senior academic fellow for a semester.
My name is Nicholson Price, and I was an academic fellow at the Petrie Flom Center from 2012 until 2014. I'm an assistant professor of law at the University of New Hampshire, and it's hard to imagine how I could have been better prepared than by my time at the Petrie Flom Center.
I really benefited from the sense of community and the collaborations and the faculty mentorship.
Both Holly Lynch and Glenn Cohen have been, were great mentors for me as a student and continue to be great connections and just great mentors to me as I grow in my career.
I worked with tremendous mentors, including Glenn, Ben, and Holly, and really learned how to think carefully and thoroughly about important issues of health law and how to take those thoughts and put them into scholarship that's hopefully meaningful, useful, and that people will actually read.
They gave me the time and the space to think about my writing, to think about health insurance and healthcare regulation, and also the mentorship to be able to go down that pathway. Each of them pushed my writing, pushed my thinking, and helped me think about going out into the academic world and becoming an academic. And without them, I wouldn't be where I am today. I also am so grateful to the Petrie Flom Center for being a home I can come back to. There have been events and there have been opportunities through working with Glenn and others at the center to be able to continue to engage with Petrie Flom in intellectual work.
The center does a great job of helping to advance the conversation about health law and bioethics, and it mostly does that through people.
My time at the center was stimulating and productive. It's a great place to collaborate with other researchers who are studying all facets of health law and policy.
As big as the law school is, it's another great thing that Harvard has done to create a community within the broader community. And, you know, the people who were academic fellows or student fellows with me when I was at Harvard are now my go-to people.
I developed a strong international network with colleagues from the US, Europe, and Asia. This did not only lead to new academic collaborations, but also to lasting friendships.
One of the center's crowning achievements, from my perspective, is its promotion of interdisciplinary research and problem solving. The work coming out of and showcased by the center combines legal analysis with economics, psychology, philosophy, medicine, and other disciplines to tackle the problems of the day.
We wanted to create a health law policy workshop that would feature cutting-edge work in the field, as well as a series of conferences and lectures that would make Harvard Law School a vibrant place for the creation and the dissemination of new ideas in health law, policy, bioethics, and biotechnology.
One of the best parts of the student fellowship is participation in the Health Law and Policy Workshop. In the workshop, academics with expertise in healthcare or healthcare law are brought in to share their works in progress. The topics in the workshop range from privacy issues related to, genetics, the efficacy of health policy interventions, economics of healthcare, insurance law. And so I have a better understanding for the pressures and the new issues facing the healthcare system.
The center's annual conferences bring together a real community of scholars nationwide, but also bringing together scholars from across the discipline.
The conferences are even bigger opportunities for the center to shape the larger contribution, bringing in folks from around the country, around the world, and around the different schools at Harvard to talk about the key issues of bioethics and health law and biotechnology that are relevant right then.
Due to the unique cross-disciplinary competence and culture that is to be found here, the Petrie Flom Center will play a preeminent role in researching this area and finding answers to pressing questions.
When I think about the role of Petrie Flom in the world of law more broadly, the Petrie Flom Center has really brought credibility to health law that has long deserved and has been lacking.
The Petrie Flom Center has really been a transformative force for health law and bioethics and health policy in the United States and increasingly worldwide. It's become sort of an epicenter for thought and research in this area.
The Petrie Flom Center has been a place that people in the external world and people in academia continue to look to for expertise, for people who are high-quality thinkers and scholars, for events that bring high-quality thinkers and scholars together on the Harvard campus, and for real expertise in the areas of health law policy and bioethics.
It's also trained an entire generation of law students to practice in the health law field and trained a generation of health law professors that are now at top universities around the country.
I think the center has done a remarkable job in placing health law scholars throughout the legal academy in a way that will bear fruit for years and years to come.
It played a very big role in my decision to ultimately not only become a practicing physician, but to become a professor and to continue to work on improving the healthcare system.
It's just really a beacon for people interested in healthcare and healthcare law.
I'm extremely grateful to have begun my career at the Petrie Flom Center. I'm thoroughly enjoying continuing to write, study, teach, mentor people who go out to have a great influence on the practice of health law, onto the development of health policy, and I wouldn't be where I am today without my 2 years at Petrie Flom.
Thanks so much, and I really appreciate my time at the center.
Happy 10th birthday, and here's to another 10 years.
Congratulations to the center on a most productive and influential 10 years, and I look forward to the next 10 and beyond.
I could not be prouder of where they have taken the center, and I can't wait to see what the next 10 years bring.
So that is our video. I have to thank Chrissy Hutchison-Jones. Who is our administrative director of the center, who figured out a way to put all of that together in a way that looked quite professional and only had minor technological glitches throughout. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. Well, between seeing what I looked like 10 years ago and hearing the dean told me I used to be young, this has been a mixed blessing, this event so far. But we are extremely proud of what we've accomplished today, and we think that Joe would have been very proud too. Joe never envisioned the center as a monument to himself. Instead, he provided a time-limited gift for immediate use so that the center would be able to hit the ground running for maximum impact on health law policy, biotechnology, and bioethics. We've been lucky to extend the life of the center, especially through grant-funded research. But as the initial gift winds down, we've given a lot of thought to what we want to hope to accomplish by the time we have our 20th anniversary and what it'll take to make that growth a reality. First, we're very excited to continue all the work we've started to already develop scholarship and new scholars in health law, bioethics, biotechnology. This means continuing and expanding the fellowship program for graduate students, postdocs, and senior visitors, issuing invitations specifically designed to support key topical priorities for the center, while also preserving a space for scholars to pursue novel ideas that are all their own. In terms of events and programmings, we plan to continue our strong tradition of annual conferences and panel discussions, which allow us to explore cutting-edge and underexplored issues in health policy, bringing in renowned speakers, exposing students in the broader community to leading experts, and generating new scholarship and dialogue with policymakers. We're pursuing a variety of opportunities to expand the reach of these programs, including making recordings available as podcasts, developing a health law and policy book series with a major publisher to facilitate publication that we produce out of each of our annual conferences. With regard to those publications, we've also been thrilled with the initial reception of the Journal of Law and the Biosciences, which launched in 2014 and has already become a top placement for leading scholars seeking to reach interdisciplinary audiences. We expect this collaboration with Duke and Stanford to continue for the foreseeable future, contributing to the scholarly conversation and offering opportunities to students as well as a place to publish. Our blog is already going strong. It reaches about 18,000 unique monthly visitors and gets picked up by the mainstream press with extreme frequency. Going forward, we plan to explore new options to host blogging symposia on specific topics, introducing Q&As with policymakers, and expanding opportunities for public engagement with our work. One of the biggest changes over the first decade of the Center is that we're now actively engaged in a variety of sponsored research programs to which the Center itself produces work product as opposed to just our individual scholars producing independent scholarship. At first, these projects came to us as science and medicine funders increasingly looked to researchers to address the legal and ethical components of various aspects of healthcare, and our colleagues came to recognize the sort of contributions we and our people could make to their work. Thus, we were invited by our colleagues at the medical school, affiliated hospital, and others to join their projects to advance the health of professional football players, the NFL project, which you've heard a little bit about already, to improve recruitment to clinical trials in an ethical and regulatorily appropriate way, and to address the oversight of patient-centered research. We continue to receive and are excited by such invitations to join various projects, including one recently focused on regulatory barriers to research with controlled substances. But going forward, our plan is to expand our capacity to independently pursue funding for projects of our own selection, a more proactive approach to applying our expertise where we think it'll be most helpful. We also plan to continue our successful collaborations in particular policy areas and to launch several new ones. Our work with the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at MGH via the Project on Law and Applied Neuroscience has generated critical policy discussions regarding the neuroscience of pain in law, as well as adolescent brain development and legal responsibility. And just this month, in fact, we did the press release, I think, yesterday, we launched a new collaboration with the Coalition for the Transformation of Advanced Care to foster development of improved models of care for individuals with serious advanced illness nearing end of life, through interdisciplinary analysis of important health law and policy issues.
Thanks, Glenn. So Glenn has just gone over the first part of our 10-year plan, which is all of the types of things that we hope to continue over the next decade. I'm going to take a few minutes now to talk about some new ideas that we have and hope to launch over the next 10 years. So, in addition to these plans to continue and improve on our existing work, we're hoping to expand our capacity to influence policymaking in health law, biotechnology, and bioethics over the next decade by garnering sufficient resources to establish several new topical programs within the center. And these programs will ideally be organized and poised to interact substantively with policymakers at all levels, providing independent expert analysis, policy recommendations, empirical research, and practical solutions to pressing issues, precisely as the Project on Law and Applied Neuroscience and the Project on Advanced Care and Health Policy do at present. So these topical programs that we have in mind are really intended to be a response to a problem that we've been facing increasingly over the past several years, which is just that our existing faculty, staff, and fellows, who are frankly relatively small in number at any given time, despite our dense alumni pool, have become stretched quite thin, which has sometimes meant that we've had to pass up or limit our involvement in exciting opportunities that have come our way because, as energetic as we are, there's only so many hours in the day. So we've also had sort of a limited capacity to pursue new projects of our own selection where we think our expertise would be useful, especially projects that would get out ahead of cutting-edge policy issues to develop the data and analysis needed to implement change when the time is right. And so I think a perfect example of this is, Glenn was just engaged in an email exchange with somebody who's very interested in concurrent surgeries that have been in the news lately. And this is a topic where I think health law and policy is really critically important. It's a great example of somewhere where we'd like to get out ahead of reporters and ahead of problems in this area. So we're actively working at present to develop the resources needed to launch at least 3 new topical programs, expanding on work that's been begun over the first decade, and actually mirroring the panel topics that we'll hear today. These topical programs will ideally pair an expert staff of permanent or semi-permanent in-house associates and policy fellows at the center, with faculty, students, and other collaborators at Harvard and beyond, in order to generate policy briefs, white papers, model legislation, public commentary, and real-time responses to emerging issues and opportunities. These programs ideally will also be well poised to develop grant applications or seek out on other types of funding that would further the center's capacity. And really the idea here is to pursue creative approaches along the lines of a laboratory model that's often used in other fields. Of course, throughout all of this expansion and growth that we're hoping to pursue, we will remain committed to maintaining our central focus on unbiased and nonpartisan analysis. So with a little bit more specificity, what are the types of topical programs that we have in mind? The first would focus generally on law and bioethics, covering such topics as human subjects research and regulation, reproductive health and technology, organ donation policy, neuroscience, genetics, and end-of-life issues, among others. The next topical program we have in mind would focus on healthcare delivery and finance, covering topics such as health insurance policy, industry consolidation, regulation of medical professions and professionals, fraud and abuse, and the like. And the third topical program would address medical innovation and law, focused on intellectual property and innovation policy as relevant to pharmaceuticals, devices, and other medical interventions. So those are just a couple of examples. We have other ideas for topical programs or subtopics that we might seek to address, all, again, with a law and policy focus. So, for example, empirical health law is a developing area where we have some fellows who've really staked out some ground in this area. It's critically important to policymaking. Mental health policy, race and health policy, health information technology, among many others. But the key takeaway here is that over the course of the center's second decade, we're really seeking to develop a robust research agenda and a laboratory of experts that will help shape healthcare policy in new and exciting ways, based on strong evidence and proactive rather than responsive expert analysis. Our first decade has really set us up to do precisely this, as the center has become widely recognized and respected across the country and around the world. Indeed, we see the second decade's vision as the next logical step in advancing Joe's vision by bringing scholarly analysis to the world of health law policy. And as evidenced by the increasing slate of health news every single day, the need has clearly never been greater. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and invite you to join us as we pursue these goals over the next several years so that our next decade can be even better than our last. So we'll now move on to the substance of the day. Enough about telling you how great the center is. We're going to show you how great the center is. And we'll start by discussing healthcare coverage, costs, and fragmentation. And so just a brief programming note. We have 4 panels over the course of the day. For each of the panels, Glenn or I will introduce the moderator. The moderator will briefly introduce the panelists, but you have information about everybody in your packets, and we know you all know how to Google, so you can find out more information than the panelists might want you to know about them. The first panel is going to be moderated by Andrew Klaber. Andrew is an analyst at Paulson and Company in New York, and he's the president and founder of Even Ground, which is previously known as Orphans Against AIDS, which is an international nonprofit organization that provides academic support, basic health care, and nutrition to more than 1,500 children who have been orphaned or made vulnerable by HIV/AIDS. Andrew earned his BA at Yale, summa cum laude, his MS at the University of Oxford, and most importantly, his JD and MBA at Harvard, where in 2010 he graduated from HBS with distinction and was a recipient of the Dean's Award. Among his many other accomplishments, Andrew is a recipient of the President's Environmental Youth Award, and in 2014, he received the Yale Jefferson Public Service Award for his innovative and sustained contributions to society. That's a pretty big deal. In addition, he served on the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Orphaned and Vulnerable Children, presented on his nonprofit Even Ground at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and perhaps most impressively, pedaled 4,200 miles from New Haven, Connecticut to San Francisco to raise awareness and financial support for Habitat for Humanity. So welcome, Andrew, and if the panelists can join us up on the podium.
On behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank Dean Martha Minow, Glenn, and Holly for assembling us. This panel comes from all stretches and corners of the United States. And I'd just like to say, as a student here from 2006 to 2010, I had the great privilege of learning about Joe Flom, who I would categorize as the legal legend. During my time as a student, I learned the great debate over the corporate bastion, which was a lifelong conversation between Joe Flom and Marty Lipton. And I can tell you, Judy, that our country and our society are so much better off because of that conversation. I have the distinguished pleasure of introducing our panel. First, we have Einar L. Haag, who you heard from initially on the video, the founding faculty director of the Petrie Flom Center. In addition to health law, Einar's research interests include antitrust, law and economics, and law and political theory. We have at the end Robert Greenwald, who is a clinical professor of law and the director of the Center for Health Law Policy and Innovation at Harvard Law School. Robert's work addresses LGBT law and policy, HIV law and policy, and Robert was just telling me that he serves on the President's Council for HIV, and access to health care for low-income populations. Directly to my left, we have Allison Hoffman, professor of law at UCLA. Her work in health law addresses the Affordable Care Act, Medicare and retiree health care expenses, and long-term care. Last but not least, we have Abigail Moncrief, associate professor and Peter Paul Career Development Professor at Boston University School of Law. In addition to healthcare, she works on constitutional law and legislative process, and her current research addresses individual autonomy in healthcare decision-making. In terms of our panel's program, we'll have a few moderator-led questions followed by audience Q&A. And with that, let's get into it. So the dust has settled on the Affordable Care Act, all 1,800 plus or minus a couple hundred pages of it. The Affordable Care Act, AKA Obamacare, or the ACA. What are some of the greatest successes as well as the ongoing challenges related to healthcare coverage, cost, and fragmentation that this piece of legislation addresses?
Well, I think
one of the most obvious successes is that it's expanded access to health insurance. So the estimates are a little bit all over the place, but it seems like about 15 or 16 million people are now insured who weren't before. And it did that through a very complex set of regulations and requirements, including the individual mandate, which made its way to the Supreme Court. But I think that's been one of the most obvious successes in the near term. It also probably, in my opinion, leads to one of the greatest challenges, which is when you get people insured, how do you make sure they can actually get access to health care? So that's, as you start to peel off the layers, you see, okay, now there are all these people with health insurance who don't have a clear sense of who they can go to for health care, what providers are covered under their health insurance, and it's not clear that the providers out there in some areas, geographically in some fields of medicine, actually have the capacity to treat these people. So I think those two go hand in hand.
I would add to that on the challenge side that too many people are just left behind. I mean, it's great that we've made great strides in terms of access, but we've made no progress really in terms of how we handle the healthcare needs of immigrant populations, still really excluded from healthcare. And then because the Medicaid expansion is optional based on the Supreme Court decision that we'll probably talk more about, there are about 3 million people in the Southeast in particular, again, place that has the worst health outcomes that are really basically denied access to healthcare. So I agree, great success in terms of expanded access, but too many people left behind, let alone the access challenges that you mentioned.
So I would say probably to me the most surprising success has been actually slowing down the cost curve. So the rate of growth in healthcare cost has gone down since the act was put in place, which some people predicted, but a lot of people said the opposite would happen. So it is notable. And I think part of the reason that's happened is that there's a lot of regulations in Obamacare that allow the federal government to reduce fragmentation in healthcare. There's a lot of laws, particularly at the state level, that unduly fragment healthcare decision making, so that the average, Medicare patient has like 8 or 10 doctors that they see, and are often not coordinated together. So there's been some help with that. One of the challenges on that front, though, has been we were trying to encourage integration, but there's sometimes encouraging too much horizontal integration that leads to market power. So one interesting study, sort of followed up. The Dartmouth study is very famous about how healthcare costs vary a lot from region to region. Well, a recent study shows that a huge cause of that variation is actually local market power, and that's what's causing costs to be so high in some places. So I think that's a big thing to address. And on coverage, I guess I have the sense it's great we have covered more people. It's disappointing that it didn't do even better. And I think the big problem to overcome there is really political divisiveness. Because the Medicaid expansion should be extremely attractive. It's just become such a political football that it's not being embraced. So that's going to be one of the big challenges for the future. Can we find a way to overcome our political divisiveness to do common sense healthcare reform?
Well, and I think on that front, time will be important and will cut in our favor. I mean, I think as we're seeing more and more states getting on board gradually, it's just going to take a little bit of time for the we hate Obamacare rhetoric to die down before we'll get there. But eventually, I'm guessing that all states will expand Medicaid. Just as eventually all states adopted Medicaid in the first instance, it took 21 years before Arizona got on board, right? So it'll take some time, but I think we'll get there eventually. But I do think that one of the challenges of Obamacare in terms of fragmentation is that it retains state-by-state fragmentation even independently of the Medicaid expansion. So it retains state-specific exchanges and state insurance commissioner role in accepting or rejecting the sales of insurance policies within each state, which contributes to that I can't say the word oligopolistic or monopolistic power in the insurance market. And if instead we had adopted the House version of the bill and had a single national exchange, we would have been able to address some of that market power issue in state private insurance markets. So one thing that I'm a little bit maybe naively hopeful about is that with the state-based exchanges struggling financially and the federally facilitated exchanges succeeding financially, we might end up with more states turning over their exchanges to healthcare.gov, and then insurance commissioners will have a little bit less of a stake in how the exchanges are being run, or a little bit less of a role. We might end up moving, again, with a lot of time, in that direction of more nationalization of the private insurance regulation as well.
Although I think that the point you raise is very important in that I don't think we ever could have expected that the federal government would be running as many of the exchanges as they are, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services certainly ultimately has some authority over the marketplace plans. It is still supposed to sit with the state insurance regulators. Because they've gone to federal exchanges and really pretty much wiped their hands of any responsibility for the ACA, what we're seeing is a raft of unfair, discriminatory insurance practices that are frankly allowed to continue within the marketplace. And if we had time, I can certainly describe them related to transparency, coverage, and cost. And again, I think CMS is reluctantly, and HHS stepping up to try to have strategies for addressing it, but a little bit too little, too late. So for example, they have said for plans that discriminate in unfair in terms of coverage or co-insurance, they're saying that they'll use an outlier strategy, which would then look at the plans within a state and sort of pick the ones that have the most egregious practices. Frankly, in 2014, it might have been okay to have an outlier strategy. But now that we're at 2016 and we've seen so many of the plans move in that direction, I don't really think an outlier strategy is sufficient. So I would agree. I think part of your point is that there's really insufficient coordination around regulation and accountability that results from the states having authority over insurance regulation, but not necessarily assuming that responsibility.
The optimistic version of the story is the national government will start regulating more. The pessimistic version of the story is that we'll just end up in a perpetual cycle of buck passing, and nobody will regulate, and we'll.
So maybe the best solution is that at least the anti-discrimination provisions final rules should come out within the next week or two. Section 1557 does include a private right of action, at least in the the drafts of it. And if that's the case, then what we may find ourselves in is the situation of having to litigate in these kinds of issues.
So I think this discussion actually highlights what I see as one of the great challenges, which is that the drafters of this law decided to build out on private insurance markets. And when you're doing that, you can regulate, and the complexity of the regulation of these insurance markets is that it's at the state level, right? So there's like federal overlay now to this regulation, and you can attempt to try to corral the insurers and get them to behave in different ways. But then you have enforcement issues, which now happen at 50 states and at the federal level. And you have insurers who are really crafty. They, for years, have been working to figure out how to profit by sorting people into different categories of risk. And even if you tell them they're not allowed to do so anymore, they figure out new ways to do so. There were stories that, I think it was in Florida, that the insurers were putting certain HIV/AIDS drugs on higher tiers, so that people who knew that they would need those drugs wouldn't choose those insurance companies. They would instead, opt into policies with other insurers. So they were sorting out what they consider bad risks in that way. So that's what the decision was to, for at least part of the expansion, to build out on private markets. And this is the complexity of what it means to try to create greater access relying on private insurers to achieve those goals.
One hopeful note, as Abby said, in the beginning, the House, led by Nancy Pelosi, wanted to have national exchanges. And you may have noticed in the Republican debates, this may be the one thing that Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump agree on in the world, which is he's all about getting rid of those borders, right, the state borders. So this has actually become a strong Republican trope about healthcare, that the artificial boundaries of markets on state borders has impeded competition. So maybe there's some prospect for something bipartisan to get nationwide exchanges, nationwide markets for insurance. And I think competition would help. We're going to need some regulation as well, but a greater amount of competition would be highly beneficial to healthcare policy in the United States.
Can I quickly just name
Absolutely,
one other
Robert.
success? I just think that this focus on early intervention and prevention and a move away from a disability and sick care system is also potentially transformative. And so whether it's the Medicaid expansion, whether it's the free preventive services, whether it's a new investment in the Prevention and Public Health Fund, we had time, we could talk more about it. I think all of these are at least a sign, a recognition that we really need to move away from this, again, sick disability care system and focus more on early intervention and prevention. And we see that in the ACA, although, of course, there are challenges that we could spend time talking about as well.
We already see from these opening remarks a couple of puzzle pieces emerging, thematic puzzle pieces, if you will, around coverage, access, regulation, and cost. And I'd like to hone in just for a moment on the cost side. In 2014, the total U.S. spending on healthcare increased 5.3% to $3 trillion, or more than 17% of U.S. GDP. To what extent does the Affordable Care Act make a move from pay for service to pay for outcome or pay for performance? And are there other good ideas for containing U.S. spending on healthcare?
So I think it's made some moves, and it's particularly with what they call bundle payments for a bundle of services, and moves particularly towards encouraging greater integration. But I would say not gone far enough in terms of the regulations for sensible political reasons. But nonetheless, the accountable care organizations have led to somewhat greater coordination, but they've had a hard time containing costs. And I think the reasons were predictable. I can say that because I predicted it, which is that they don't have enough power. So when we buy things in the United States used through corporations who are integrated, you buy your airplane ticket, they deal with all the coordination of all the things to get you from point A to point B. If you go to a hotel, they deal with all the things to get your room ready. You don't have to have, as a consumer yourself, manage all these different people. And so, unfortunately, with the ACOs, they're still pretty thin networks. They have a small amount of profit sharing. But going back to basic legal theory about the theory of the firm and Ronald Coase, they don't quite have the command and control within the firm that they need to really be efficient and integrated. And so I think that's going to be the next step. And there's surprisingly broad regulatory powers in the Affordable Care Act that would allow CMS to encourage that.
So one of the biggest barriers to meaningful payment reform, in my view, is that we still don't know enough about what's actually efficient and optimal in terms of consumption. We just don't know. We just don't know what works and what doesn't in medicine, and it's so variable across humans that we haven't. The science is just not there yet. There's just too much uncertainty, I think, in terms of how much and of what kind of healthcare an individual ought to be consuming in order to get better. So I think one of the things that the ACA does decently, although could have done more, is trying to encourage and fund comparative effectiveness research, so that which to me seems like the first necessary step in meaningful payment reform. So all the talk at this point about pay for performance, sure, we can not reimburse you when you cut off the wrong leg in an amputation. That's obvious. That was not a good consumption or an efficient consumption of medical care. And when you are readmitted for a hospital-acquired infection or something along those lines, where we think, okay, there are preventative things we could do. The obvious things we can address and we have addressed to some extent and can continue to under the regulatory powers that I mentioned. But I think in order to achieve really big systemic changes in that direction, we just need to know more. So I think that's something that Obamacare is moving in the direction of. But
I don't actually see the accountable care organizations and this piece of the reform as having great potential for reducing costs.
Yeah.
The way I look at it is that we could, if it works in the way envisioned, we might improve quality. We might actually get people better health care. But I think even the way it was designed, kind of staying hooked into fee-for-service payments and other pieces of it, it wasn't really, even from the beginning, from the design intentionally, going to dramatically decrease costs. And I think that a lot of times when we talk about costs and addressing the cost problem, we work around the margin here, in part because it's such a political hot button, right? And so if you go at the places where the real cost centers are and you think about reducing costs in the system, people make money based on those costs. There's a lot of profit based on that, and it's really sensitive. We don't know exactly what the right mix of healthcare is, and we are trying lots of different ways to get to, through comparative effectiveness research, through coordinated care, to get to those right answers. But we do know that we spend a heck of a lot more than other countries, and we don't get as good of results as they get. So, why is that? Well, a lot of the evidence does show that we spend a lot of money on higher-end technology in ways that might not be effective, but it also shows that we pay more for every unit of care that we use than in other countries. We don't actually use more inpatient care. We don't actually use more outpatient care, but we pay more for every single interaction that somebody has with the healthcare system. And I think that reforms like accountable care organizations don't get at the heart of where that spending is in a way that has true potential for addressing the cost problem.
Yeah. Well, let me just add, I think the reason why it didn't work isn't necessarily because there's no potential for organizations to work, but they didn't give them the tools. So they do have this mechanism where the organization gets to share in cost save. So if they can show that they lowered costs, all the doctors who belong to an accountable care organization can share in those financial gains. The trouble is, as Alison correctly says, the dominant motive is to charge more fee for service. And so you have this group that's not integrated into one organization and can really control things. So you have a massive free rider problem. Everybody says, well, let's coordinate a little bit to lower our costs. Then we get to, everybody would share equally in some small fraction of the overall cost savings. Well, the incentive to do that versus just yourself, just order the service, you make much more money by practicing medicine in a profitable way. So I think we're going to have stronger institutions to really deal with that free rider problem for them to be effective. But I think it can be a way station. I think at least it's gotten doctors used to the idea of working together in collaboration with other doctors in some form of organization. And you can imagine that moving to the next step of actual integrated firms.
Robert, I agree with everything that everybody has said, but I would also add that I think that costs are driven by our inability to address the healthcare needs and the social determinants of health related to the 5% of people on Medicaid that, for example, consume 50% of all Medicaid expenditures, or the fact that on the Medicare program, we spend 30% of all of our funding in Medicaid on the last year of people's lives. And I think that there are some tough choices and programs in both of those directions, in terms of the Medicaid, the sickest of the sick populations, that we could effectively reduce cost, and we don't pay enough attention to that. So I think that's a major cost driver. I have some hope for accountable care organizations and value-based insurance design and bundle payments, but I truly think that until we really start to look at who are the people that are driving healthcare costs and what's driving healthcare costs. And again, there are some very low-cost interventions that focus on social determinants of health, like food is medicine, for example, that have been proven study after study to dramatically reduce healthcare costs of our sickest of our sick Medicaid, Medicare populations. But we still haven't gotten to a place where we can integrate that into the healthcare system. So,
and we do know that other countries spend a lot more on public health.
On public health and addressing social determinants of health. And I do think that's a major driver of costs.
Well, and I think, on end-of-life care, that's a major driver of costs. That's such talk about a political hot button. I mean, mention anything about end-of-life care, and Sarah Palin's going to scream death panels, and the entire thing's going to crumble. So
that gets to the point that we have to have better messaging. Right? Because end-of-life care just means informed decision-making by people and their families. It's an empowered decision-making. I don't personally believe that we should be shying away from it because we did get so creamed by Obamacare is going to kill your grandmother through death panels.
I'm not sure that shying away from it is right. I'm also not sure that messaging will work, because I'm not sure that there was a failure in messaging in the Obamacare. I mean, the Obamacare provision that Palin labeled a death panel had absolutely nothing to do, right? It was a purely informative provision that had nothing to do with rationing or anything. It wasn't even close to getting to the heart of the issue, and Palin still managed to
I agree.
I mean, I'm not sure. She wasn't even really pointing to anything in particular. She was just screaming. So, like, what are you going to do?
But it worked.
I'd like for us to take the political football and run with it. And my question for the panel is, what can the politics of the ACA teach us about future attempts at health reform? And to the extent that any of you want to comment on specific presidential candidate approaches, but really, what are the political lessons learned from the process of ultimately passing the ACA?
Yeah. So back in 2008, I was advising the Obama campaign. And you may remember back then, there was only one big issue that divided him and Hillary Clinton, which was he was against the mandate and she was for the mandate. And I just think politically, he turned out to have been absolutely right in the campaign and wrong as president, because the mandate just turned out to be so politically divisive, and more for reasons of framing than anything. I mean, if you had made it the healthcare tax credit or the healthcare deduction, people would not be upset. People are not up in arms in the streets about the fact that if you don't have a mortgage on your house, you pay more in taxes. Because we call it the mortgage deduction. If we call it the mortgage mandate, people would be all offended and upset. So I think that, unfortunately, wasn't really necessary in terms of framing it. It was politically problematic, even though it originally came from the Heritage Foundation. It turns out that doesn't really help you very much in political debates. And that it's had legs, unfortunately, because they've resisted lots of things in terms of implementation to make it more effective as a result, especially the Medicaid expansion. So I do think we have to be more sensitive to mandate versus credit sort of framing issues.
But that's something we really learned through this reform. Was I don't think any of us would have predicted how contentious it would have been and how much people would have dug their heels in ahead of time. I mean, the individual mandate had just rolled out in Massachusetts, but with universal support from all the different interest groups. So that to me is a real lesson of this reform: is do not underestimate the potential for kind of contentiousness and.
Are you saying we can't assume that all American voters are like Massachusetts voters?
Well, and that Congress, I think we've learned, kind of how Congress can operate in extreme ways in the past few years. Which, maybe we've seen streams of that through history, but it's a reminder that there is the potential for.
Right. Although I will say, candidate Obama foresaw it. He said, "Oh, well, that's just inherently wrong to mandate things. It's just not going to sell."
He also didn't think it was necessary. He thought if you got the right subsidies in place, that you could get people to buy in.
Well, yeah, and I think that's right. So if you get the right, we really need to pool people in some fashion, but carrots are better than sticks.
It's hard to know, though. It's hard to know, though, whether carrots would have worked to get as many people enrolled as a stick. I mean, I think, it not only, it sells politically better in part because it feels less obligatory and therefore causes fewer people to actually comply with the regulatory incentive, right? So, I don't feel like I need to have a mortgage on my house in order to avoid paying a tax, but I do feel like I need to have health insurance in order to avoid paying a tax, even though relative, when I'm thinking about my base, I should be thinking about them equivalently. I should be thinking about those two things in economically identical terms.
In fact, the tax penalty not having a mortgage is far higher than
Right. But and I'm relative to the general population, a more rational thinker probably, but I still feel that there's a difference, and it's in part because of the messaging. So then, whether it would have worked to have said you get a $700 tax credit if you have health insurance, as opposed to saying you get a $700 tax penalty if you don't have health insurance, whether that would have gotten 16 million people enrolled, I don't know. And so then if you want the law to succeed, you might need to bear that political cost. And it was a cost the Democrats could afford, or thought they could afford, if only Martha Coakley hadn't screwed up. But, at the time.
Just counterpoint is that for employment, that's basically what we have a successful system of employment insurance, even though I don't think employment's the greatest locus for insurance, but it's mainly because we have a tax subsidy, because employers can declare it as an expense, and that turns out to be enough to get people to pool. So I'm a little more hopeful that without the word mandate, we could have accomplished.
Well, I
the
do
same
think that
thing.
employers are far more rational thinkers than individuals, particularly the individuals that we care about getting into the pools. Right. So I'm not sure.
So maybe this is naive, but on the purely political side, maybe one of the lessons is you have to sort of sell the store in order to enact something like an ACA, which includes, compromises with all the major stakeholders like pharma, insurers, medical device companies, and so that the mandate, in a way, helped to buy off insurers and their opposition to some of the insurance reforms like elimination pre-existing condition preclusion, annual lifetime caps, the no premium rating based on health status, and that any other mechanism might have really built opposition from the insurance industry during the enactment phase.
Which I think that's an endogenous, like, would a credit have satisfied the insurers?
That's a good question.
Right, as opposed to a mandate.
As opposed to a mandate.
So the framing is costly politically, but it might also be beneficial in terms of, both politically and in terms of compliance after the fact, right? And so then, I don't know.
I don't know either.
So one interesting thing is after the
We didn't test it,
Obamacare,
right? In any other states, we didn't try doing a credit as opposed to a mandate or a penalty.
after Chief Justice Roberts' opinion, in some ways, you're only supposed to call it now a tax penalty,
Anyway.
not
Right.
a mandate, because that's how they
Right.
survive constitutionally.
Yes, that's true.
But I do think that, in fact, the messaging is, it's a mandate, surprisingly, despite the Supreme Court ruling. If you look on their websites, when they talk to people, they say, it's a healthcare mandate, which query whether...
Health insurance mandate. You don't have to eat the broccoli. You just have to buy it.
That's exactly.
Allison, you mentioned other countries spend less on healthcare and in many respects get better outcomes. Are there specific countries that you have in mind, and what are the transferable lessons that we could take to the American healthcare system? And that's for you and the entire panel.
Yeah, so yes, there are a lot of other countries you can have in mind, because if you look at every year, the OECD does a comparative study when it looks at spending and health and outcomes in different countries, and the U.S. always ranks kind of at the bottom of that study. So most other OECD countries you could look to for for different insights here. And every time I look at that, I think of three different things. I think of part of what Robert was talking about, which is distributional issues. Part of why we don't get the outcomes and this is a piece that we'll see what happens over time as the Affordable Care Act is rolled out. But part of why we don't get the outcomes is because we have uneven use of medicine. Some people are using a lot, and some are getting none, no access. And I think about kind of what particular types of medicine we're using and how we're using it. We use more kind of technology at the boundaries that may or may not be having the kind of outcomes that we want for what we're paying. And we're not good at discerning necessarily when yes, we should be paying and when we shouldn't be paying. And we also use specialist care more than primary care, more than the other countries do. So we're paying more in that regard. And just we pay more per unit of care. And if you look at, there's a lot of talk when we think about the cost problem, people talk about utilization, that we use too much care. And I think that diverts attention from the kind of the complexity of the utilization story, which I think is more about what kind of care we're using, but the fact that the price that we're paying per unit of care is way more than what we pay in other countries. McKinsey does a study where it looks at what we would expected spending adjusted to wealth in different areas, and like, for example, like the two buckets where we spend more than we should as adjusted to wealth the most are outpatient care is the main one. And a lot of that is because for that kind of care, we're paying more per every unit than other countries are paying. So that's, I think that when you look at the global story, it shows us actually that there's a lot of space where we could think about solving the cost problem that we're not. But as I said earlier, like part of why we're not doing that is because every time we pay more for healthcare, it's somebody's salary and it's somebody's profit.
Right.
And that's hard space to embark on.
In some of the countries at the top of that OECD list, would these be, for example, Scandinavian countries where there's universal, maybe a little bit more? Which countries
they all have universal health care.
Yeah.
We've been an outlier in that regard for many years. Most of them do global budgeting, where there's some kind of central function where people are thinking about, this is how much we want to spend on healthcare, and this is how we're going to divide it up. I think really the lesson is not to look at any one individual country, but to kind of look at the field and say, we could probably do better than we are in this regard.
Yeah, so I would say a big thing that the European countries do is this budgeting. And the reason that's important is it means somebody actually in the system is thinking about the overall trade-off of costs and benefits. In our system, all too much, nobody's thinking about that. You just have a system where we pay for services, people choose what services to get, but their decision is insured, the doctors are making decisions, but they're not paying for the cost of it. So the trouble is we have this market system that we want to rely on, but we don't do what we normally do with the market, which is force somebody to make cost-benefit trade-offs. So if you want to have that kind of insurance-based system, you need to empower somebody to do it. So in these countries, I think they do a good job of that. They also do a good job of bargaining to keep fees down. So in our country, I think, unfortunately, there's very little bargaining. Sometimes it's disabled by Congress, or Medicare can't bargain about drug prices, for example, and that we have allowed too much market power, so that there's entities who are charging a huge amount of money. So it turns out a big difference between the United States and Europe isn't just that we do a lot more healthcare, it's that we charge a lot more for exactly the same stuff when we're doing it.
I don't know. I'm not a comparative scholar. I'm very much an Americanist, so I know little about what the other countries' structures are. But I joked earlier. You mean you can't assume that Massachusetts voters are like the rest of American voters? And I think that joke can be extended easily to this conversation to say, like we can look at what other countries are doing and other systems are doing, but I think we do need to, and to tie back to the previous question, I think we need to have some respect for the deep strand of laissez-faire libertarianism that exists in the United States that's much less powerful in Western Europe. And it will be a real barrier, and a legitimate one, I think. I mean, I don't think it's one that we can. I laugh about Sarah Palin screaming about death panels, but she tapped into something that's a genuine concern in large portions of the United States. Having grown up in a highly conservative neighborhood of Dallas, Texas, I can tell you that it's a powerful impulse to resist the kinds of cost-benefit policymaking and communitarian approaches to health that I think are present in other countries. So, I think we can study those other systems and try to see what they're doing well. Whether or not we can translate those into implementable realities in the United States is a much bigger, harder question, I think.
I agree with what you just said. I think in terms of politics, Bernie's plan for Medicare, for all of us to have Medicare, would move us closer to what the European systems look like, and probably reduce costs and be more effective. But Hillary's also right that probably the best hope, given the political reality, is that building off of the Affordable Care Act, and we're sort of stuck with that. And then the part I find most ironic is if you ever go to a Bernie Sanders event, you see people with signs saying, keep the government out of my Medicare, and then you think, okay, so when it comes to individuals, we really have to do some work here because Medicare is by, for, and from the government. So, we see this strain of opposition, but the reality is people love their Medicare, but just don't recognize that it is actually the government. So maybe there's some hope.
So I do think, I think you're right that the United States is more individualistic, so we're never going to accept some centralized cost-benefit, somebody making particular choices. But we could have a hybrid system where somebody figures out at the government level, well, how much of the government is going to subsidize and pay for, and then have the decisions trickle down to people in terms of having like healthcare vouchers. So so people are confronted with the scarcity issue when they choose a particular kind of health plan and make certain kinds of decisions about what to fund. So they're confronted, but they get to make individual choices. And one interesting thing is that in European countries, they're kind of moving in that direction too, from the opposite direction.
Yeah, I do wonder that. In order to make that work, you have to have some centralized price fixing, right? That's for the subsidies to work. If there's, right, or
to regulate prices.
To regulate pricing, right? Like there would have to be some price fixing occurring that I think is.
You have to control prices, or you just shift costs onto individuals, right?
Right, exactly. Because otherwise the access issues.
You could have competitive supply markets that drive prices down the cost, as long as you have somebody else making the choice about what to buy. So I think people could take their healthcare vouchers and buy a care allocating plan and choose among them whichever one they think does the best job of picking suppliers.
Right. Which would be assuming that there was transparency that doesn't currently exist, so that you could actually compare and contrast plans to be able to make informed decisions, and that given that it's a relatively complex market, that there were some sort of navigators or counselors that could actually help people make the right choices. I think there are some real barriers as to why
I think
market forces don't necessarily work
I mean,
well
I think the exchanges
when
show
you talk
that, right?
to healthcare. That's
Get
great.
on the exchange. I do this every year with my health law class. Get on the exchange
what's-
with a bunch
we
of
just-
smart people and ask them to shop for an insurance
healthcare,
plan.
yes.
And then watch them baffled as they click buttons and try to figure out what's going
We
on.
give them a fact pattern. We'll say, you are a person living with AIDS that also has these health conditions.
Yeah.
Come back with what the best plan is
Yeah.
within a particular market. Here's your zip code.
And then they
They
find all the plans.
They come
put them
back
on-
and
they
basically
put
say,
them
I
on a
can't do
dartboard.
it.
Well, Einar, you especially talked about market power and the effects that has on our healthcare system. In September of 2015, specifically September 21st, in what I will call the tweet heard round the world, especially in the specialty pharma sector, especially among the investment community, Hillary Clinton wrote the following in 140 characters or less. Quote, price gouging like this in the specialty drug market is outrageous. Tomorrow, I'll lay out a plan to take it on. Since that date, the specialty pharma sector is down 50, 60, 70%, depending on the names you look at. And this tweet really got individuals thinking about the sustainability of the following business model, which permeated and persisted among a select group of companies for a very long time. And it went like this. You borrow cheaply, debt financing, interest rates are very low. You do accretive acquisitions with that debt. You slash R&D spending, and you increase drug prices. Some companies increased their drug prices 47% per year, 2007 all the way to 2014. So the question is, what do you think the path forward looks like for these businesses?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think the trouble is, again, sort of trying to marry a very market-based system with a government insurance system at the same time, and without ever really making a very definitive choice or allowing either to work all the way. So I do think patents are incredibly valuable for encouraging new innovation that we all need to improve healthcare throughout the world. And you want to give firms intellectual property protection for that. But in other normal markets, there's a constraint, which is people are only willing to pay so much. When you have a market that's insured, the trouble is that constraint's not present. Mm. And if you disable the government from, in fact, negotiating on prices, the trouble is you get unconstrained market power. So I think we have to have some mechanism for dealing with that, and also do a better job of not allowing sort of unearned market power. I think it's one thing when firms earn market power through important innovation, but sometimes not because of regulatory barriers. You have things like, some of the most extreme examples is somebody taking over a generic antibiotic that's been around for years, but because of regulations, only one firm in the country is making it. So suddenly the price goes from $2 to $800. Well, there was no great innovation involved in that. It's just that really what's broken down used to be kind of a social constraint, which is in exchange for patent protection, the drug company said, well, we won't charge too much. We won't outrage anybody. And really, there's kind of been a moral arbitrage where drugs were bought by companies that are not shackled by those moral norms and profit by raising prices. But I think there's going to be a political backlash if that continues. So we may have a bit of a free rider problem in terms of that social norm as well.
So I agree that there's a political backlash, but in the meantime, we have such a thing as like a cure for hepatitis C, the #1 communicable disease killer in the United States, and we see insurance plans, both public and private, basically restricting access until people have advanced liver disease. And so market forces are clearly not working in that situation, Or one could argue they are, in that prices have gone down within the first year about 50% due to some competition in the marketplace, but it still seems to be beyond what, for example, Medicaid programs are willing to pay. As a result of that, by the way, my center has filed a class action lawsuit against the state of Washington for its failure to cover HCV access, because we think that, again, the issue of price is certainly a real issue, but we cannot have it be that only our lowest income, most vulnerable populations don't get access to a cure while everybody else does.
Two last questions, both pertaining to the Petrie Flom Center, and then we'll turn it over to audience Q&A. So first, what is the most important contribution that the Petrie Flom Center and its affiliates have made so far with regard to healthcare coverage, cost, and fragmentation?
Well, a number of years ago, we had a big conference on fragmentation that resulted in a book. And we brought together not just law professors, but business school professors, economists, medical people to talk about the fragmentation issue. And I thought it was interesting, a surprising consensus, which was one, that the fragmentation was not beneficial. It wasn't beneficial as a business matter, it wasn't beneficial as a medical matter, it wasn't beneficial as an economic matter. That surprised me a bit. I would have thought there would have been more defense of, oh, well, we really need to have everybody empowered autonomously to lead to the best health care. But it seemed clear that wasn't the case. And then the other clear consensus, somewhat embarrassingly, at a law school, was that the problem was the law. That it wasn't that economic forces were driving fragmentation or doctors. It was various legal constraints and restrictions. So I think that's been an important contribution, and it's helped suggest ways through the Affordable Care Act and other ways to try to break down some of those artificial legal restrictions that are encouraging excessive fragmentation.
And lastly, I'd like you to all put on your prediction hats or take out your crystal ball. Imagine the year is 2026, and we're gathered together for the 20th anniversary of the Petrie Flom Center. What are your predictions on the state of healthcare coverage, cost, and fragmentation in America?
Okay, I'll start. Well, since we just barely squeaked by having Donald Trump as our president, and Hillary came in, and people were so concerned about that experience that there was some coalescing of our government. Okay, so I'm having like this really optimistic vision here. You can take the rest of it, that we actually made the kinds of changes that needed to happen in terms of regulation, some additional regulation where regulation falls short, a little bit more oversight, monitoring, and enforcement of unfair discriminatory practices, states stepping into the expansion because that fight was certainly over, and many of the real positive outcomes of the Affordable Care Act becoming real. And the arbiters of that information, of course, is the Petrie Flom Center, because they do such incredible research to inform this every step of the way.
Abby, what are your thoughts? Thanks, Robert.
I mean, 10 years, honestly, in the lifetime of healthcare reform is not that long. So I think in 10 years, not a whole lot will have changed. I think probably we will have more states having expanded Medicaid. I think we may see some of the current state-based exchanges turned over to the federal government, to the national government. And I hope we'll know more. Back to the point about just medical uncertainty and comparative effectiveness research, my biggest hope, I think, is that in the next 10 years, we'll just gain more information about medicine. And then maybe that can translate into policy in the longer term. But but 10 years is a pretty short time scale for healthcare. Remember that the first proposal for universal health insurance in the United States was made by Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. So it took us almost 100 years to get Obamacare passed, and even that's not really universal health insurance. So in 10 years, I think we'll be having the same conversation, and it'll just have slightly different contours.
Thanks, Abby.
So by 10 years, I figure that Robert Abby Nowelson will be appointed to head Health and Human Services and CMS. So healthcare will be universal, equitable, and efficient.
We will fix it all.
Yeah, and we'll invite you back for the panel. Okay.
Yeah, I think I agree with Abby's kind of pessimistic view, and also the kind of the short term of 10 years in the time frame. But I think that the cost problem is getting more acute, and we're going to hear a lot of people talking about that. And I think that there's a reluctance to deal with some of the hard issues, and I think that that's going to remain. I mean, the problem of uninsured immigrants, a lot of the uninsured people are going to be people who are opting out of the mandate and choosing to pay that tax. And I think that the cost problem is a particularly tough one. I'm hopeful that we see some innovation on the delivery side, so that we can talk about at least better quality care and more coordination on that front 10 years from now. I hope that fragmentation at least decreases a little bit.
Nice. On the cost side, I'll say I started teaching in 1988, and everybody said, "Well, it's a cost crisis, and we'll never. We're going to finally have to deal somewhere with it." So what is it now? 20, almost 30 years later. I don't know, if you're constantly in crisis every year, it seems like it can't really be a crisis.
Can't call it a crisis.
But it does seem to be at some point we can't have 100% of GDP on healthcare. So we're going to reach the ceiling eventually.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting looking across the Atlantic as you think about refugee flows into Europe and the relatively high level of healthcare that they've made universally accessible, what effect that'll have on their economies and GDP spend on healthcare going forward. Let's turn it over to the audience. I know that there are a bunch of questions. Please line up next to the microphone and give it a shot.
In Massachusetts, if you have Medicare and you're under age 65 and you're low income, you can have $1 billion of assets, and the state will pay your co-pays, premiums, and deductibles. But the minute you turn 65, if you have more than $2,000 of assets, they will not pay anything, even if you're the lowest income and even if you're very disabled. And part of this is because the state has gotten waivers for those under 65, but not those over 65. And the state blames the Affordable Care Act, which if you read it, and I haven't read all 2,000 pages, but it does not give any coverage at all to people over 65. So my question is, should the Affordable Care Act be amended to include everybody and not only those under 65? And should all people, regardless of age, receive equal benefit in health care?
I need to look into it, what you're talking about. I believe the decision to not have an asset test on the under 65 is a state-by-state decision, and that Massachusetts has decided not to have an asset test for the under 65, which are, I think you were talking about the dually eligible Medicaid, Medicare. Whereas the Medicare population over 65, it's a federally run program, and the federal program does have an asset test. And there are some reasons why it makes sense to treat the Medicare population different than the Medicaid population, but I'm unclear about why the over 65 that still remain dually eligible wouldn't fall into some exception. So I don't know enough about the answer, but I have a sense of why they're different.
We'll get back to you.
And it's not related to the ACA, as far as I understand it.
It's an important issue about fragmentation. It's not just within
exactly.
players. It's across time in insurance.
Right. And programs. And
Yeah, so it's a frustration people have.
Okay.
Thank you. And it also shows the different roles that different programs are having. So Medicaid for the under 65 population is providing wraparound health care coverage, whereas for the over 65 population, it's mostly paying for long-term care.
That's right.
So they're treating it in different ways because the program is doing so many different things as well. Not that that's a right way to treat it. I think I write about long-term care, and I think that we have serious problems about our coverage of long-term care, including what you're talking about. But
there are so many oddities in the way that coverage works over the course of a human's lifetime, given the fact that the regulatory structure has emerged in this thoughtless, piecemeal fashion of, just piling up historical accidents and attempts to sort of plug holes here and there, instead of being a kind of single rational system. So, for instance, in states that have expanded their Medicaid populations under Obamacare, the federal government pays between 50 and 83% of your care if you were previously eligible for Medicaid, and then pays 90% of your care if you are in the expansion population, which means that if I were on Medicaid right now, I would be getting, because I'm pregnant, I would be getting only 50% of my costs covered. But then as soon as I delivered, I would switch over to the expansion population because So I mean, there's just like craziness that happens in terms of on and off switches for which program you're in, because these programs have been glued together over time.
There are things that
should it be changed? Yes. Will it be changed? No.
Right. The asset limit you're talking about, by the way, was set in 1965 at $2,000 is the asset limit, and it's never been changed. I mean, you obviously can't even afford a funeral.
Well, it's been changed to exclude a house.
There have been changes in terms of exemptions, but the $2,000 asset limit has never changed.
Yeah.
Wow. All right, Glenn.
Yeah, so thank you for a wonderful panel. I'm curious what you think about the quality of public discourse on healthcare, whether it's improved, in particular thanks to the debates on the ACA, the Supreme Court consideration, or whether it's kind of flatlined. And then to ask you about a particular kind of discourse, what do you predict in terms of healthcare's prominence in the upcoming election campaign? Do you think it will be as prominent as was in the last go-around, less prominent, more prominent, or how do you think it'll change given the candidates that look to be shaping up for the debates?
I mean, I think healthcare reform, I think, is going to be a little bit less of an issue in this campaign cycle, although I'm sure that whomever the Republicans nominate, or whatever combination of people and lunatics the Republicans nominate, whatever happens out of the Republican side, I'm sure there will be somebody who is advocating repeal of Obamacare, so that'll become something of a topic. But whether the quality of the discourse has improved, no.
Well, maybe to put a different spin on it, what are the sources that you turn to
So that's what I was going to say.
for good information?
There's like two discourses on healthcare in this country. There's kind of a popular discourse and rhetoric which stays the same. It's like the same language and the same debates back and forth over time. And then there has been a richness of kind of scholarly debate in this area on blogs like Bill of Health and other places, and cross disciplinary discussion as well. That when I'm reading things like Bill of Health or Incidental Economist or other areas, I think that there's a lot of kind of nuance and reaching out for evidence to support positions, and it could be better, and it would be nice to see some of the intellectual debate pulled up more into the popular debate as well. But I actually think that there's a lot of people who, this is when you were talking too about the center's contribution to fragmentation. I mean, that book is cited all the time for the proposition of fragmentation, and then the kind of dialogues and debates that it created, and then the scholars that have grown up in the center can talk intelligently about these things. I think that it was, kind of the beginning of that conversation, and so I'd love to see more of that space moving into.
It's interesting that you say that, because the studies that look at the use of social media imply that during all the time leading up to the ACA and its enactment, Obama was the only one of the top 10 social media users who were pro-ACA, and the other 9 were all anti-ACA. And then you look at the polling even since then, it seems that the right does a lot better job of use of social media. So when you were talking about these two areas of discourse, I think that we better bridge that divide if we are going to make a difference. And I think that gets back to sort of what I was saying at the beginning about messaging, that I don't necessarily think the pro-health reform movement does a particular great job of reaching out enough to influence public opinion.
It's funny how much harder it is, though. I mean, it's so much harder
the truth is harder than fiction sometimes.
Right. Well, and it just doesn't tap into a kind of a gut-based reactivity to say, that Obamacare is accomplishing good change. So I mean, I think that the fear-driven rhetoric remains, and I'm not sure that that part of the discourse. I completely agree with Allison that I think we've seen a lot better high-level discourse, and I think the Supreme Court's understanding of healthcare and health insurance markets improved between NFIB and King, for instance. So I think that at the intellectual level, or among the sort of the ruling class, if we can include ourselves in that, but among the ruling class, I think we've improved, but among the voter base, I'm not so sure.
Are there any authors who write for the popular press, whether it's The Atlantic or The Economist or The New Yorker or The New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, who you think does a good job, a fair job, bringing some of the experts' research into the public domain? Are there individuals who more or less consistently do a good job to elevate the conversation?
I'm not sure of their reach for everyone, but to me, I think Kaiser Family Foundation, and I know Drew's the point person, but I actually think Larry Levitt is really good. And he puts out very well thought out, reasoned, accessible information. So that's, for me, a go-to person.
Thank you, Robert.
So actually the conversation, I think, has teed up the question that I was going to ask before, which is kind of, so on the anti-health reform side, there's been some rather powerful influence from, in particular, legal academics. So Randy Barnett at Georgetown was in large part the architect of NFIB and helped destroy a giant chunk of the ACA. Are there kind of opportunities for scholarship on the pro-reform side that you think could actually make a difference? Are there unanswered questions that are feasibly answerable that would help drive things forward? And are those being asked? And if not, kind of how do we ask them?
Well, we saw Barnett and others countered on the pro-reform side from the scholarly community, right? So I think that part of the question is there more that can be done on the offensive, and who's doing that kind of work? And I think a lot of people are. I mean, I think there are, in part thanks to this center, there are a lot of people out there doing really good scholarly work, thinking about issues of health reform. But I think the more important question is how do you reach forward to what the next issues are going to be and kind of offensively put the right pieces out there. Part of what they did that was so great was they found the holes. That's part of what I learned through watching this reform, was that you can turn out, I could have predicted the individual mandate challenge, but other pieces of the law, I could not have predicted where the challenges would arise and what the legal issues would be. And so somebody who's thinking with both a good mind and a strategic mind can really create opportunity. And so I think that's a challenge to people in support of, is how do you find the pieces on the offensive to do that?
So I myself think the world would be a much better place if the Supreme Court was less involved in major healthcare policy decision making. I mean, they're not an expert body in health policy, and it just tends to make it even more politically divisive when they are involved. But it may be just sort of a necessary part of major social policy change. The early days of Social Security, there was all these Supreme Court cases and lots of challenges, and everybody came up with some argument. And that eventually calmed down, and that was a good thing, I think. So I'm hoping that the flurry will soon be over, and that we can go more to a normal kind of health policy.
That's a helpful historical perspective.
Yeah, it's also, and this relates back to the point about, the rhetoric is easier to sell when you're anti-something than when you're pro-something for some reason. And the same thing is true with litigation. There's not much you can do to file a lawsuit and go to court in favor of Obamacare, right? Because I guess there are some things like trying to get, like Boehner's lawsuit, for instance, trying to punish Obama for not enforcing the employer mandate has this kind of perversity to it, where like if he wins, he might end up with a mandatory enforcement of the employer mandate that would could potentially broaden implementation of certain aspects of Obamacare, I guess, if you think the employer mandate is good. But there's not that much you can do offensively to try to bolster Obamacare in court in ways that make headlines. So doing good research to try to and spinning good policy tales to try to message smoothing out of fragmentation or other things like that we might care about are things to think about. But I'm not sure that they'll ever get the same kind of sparkly attention that Randy Barnett and Adler and Cannon got.
Let's go to 2 last questions, and if we end a little early, you'll all get a little extra coffee time. Michael.
So I have a specific question about accountable care organizations. Might try to lead into it with a more general comment. So I appreciate him talking about healthcare costs today. There was a lot of discussion about separating out the utilization component from the price component. Allison was talking a lot about this. So thinking about prices, we talk a lot about, and I think Einer's hitting on this as well today. Provider concentration, a lot of horizontal integration that we're seeing could be contributing to some of the elevated prices. And to tie back into accountable care organizations, I've heard some people, accountable care organizations is all about vertical integration and getting some efficiencies from that. I've heard some people raise concerns that in making these pushes towards this vertical integration, we could also be contributing or exacerbating some degree of the horizontal integration that we're seeing there, and that could lead to some additional sort of price consequences and concerns. Maybe I'll take advantage of Einer being here. This is his domain. But for the group as well, is this sort of, Einer, you're concerned about accountable care organizations might have been, we're not giving them enough tools to sort of really take off now. Are you concerned about some of these things that I mentioned that I've heard others talk about, like the relationship between the vertical integration and the horizontal integration?
Yeah, I am concerned. So I think they're both not powerful enough to be vertically integrated, but unfortunately we're bringing them together in ways that increase horizontal market power. So I do think integration is not one size fits all, and antitrust has been dealing with this problem for over 100 years. Vertical forms of integration that increase efficiency without increasing market power in any particular product market are very beneficial. But horizontal integration is a closer call, because you're going to increase power, maybe you're going to increase efficiency enough to offset it. I think in healthcare, there's this unfortunate tendency to just like integration for the sake of integration, in part because a lot of people involved in healthcare don't think of it as economic markets. They think of it more like a science engineering problem. So, well, let's bring everybody together and solve the science engineering problem, and we'll just deliver the right healthcare with a big group. The trouble is they're being paid. There's financial incentives that are driving decision making. So that model would work if we had some universal government-run healthcare model. But as long as we're committed to a market system, it does seem to me that we're going to have to worry about too much horizontal integration going on.
And specifically, and then I'd love for Allison to jump in. We've seen drug companies merge, horizontal integration. We've seen insurance providers merge, horizontal. Medical device companies merge, Covidien and Medtronic. Hospitals merge. Which bucket are you most concerned about when you think about horizontal integration in the healthcare system?
I think actually I'm most concerned about horizontal integration at the local level among medical providers, hospitals and physician groups, increasing prices.
Increasing prices.
Has anyone done any studies sort of quantifying that effect at the local level?
Well, there was a study I mentioned that said that basically the variation in prices is surprisingly driven by market power. I don't know that they've traced it to particular integrations that have been allowed or not. But there have been a series across the nation of hospital mergers that have been allowed, and the agencies have done retrospectives and say, yeah, they in fact did increase prices. The trouble is that sometimes it's hard to get judges to oppose them, in part because I think the judges have the same sort of medicine as a science engineering problem model, and so when the hospitals merge and say, well, we'll just be able to be more effective, they buy it and forget about the fact that, well, they are charging for the service, and after these mergers, they tend to increase prices.
Yeah, Allison.
I think that there's been a lot of turn lately to antitrust law to think about, especially with all of the mergers going on, to think about it as a tool for controlling prices in this space, and I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical in part because the antitrust, even when it's been applied in the ways it was intended, the antitrust law over the past number of decades has increased consolidation in ways on the provider side, on the hospital doctor side, in ways that has increased bargaining power on that side and now creates problems in negotiating with the insurer side. And these questions are so complex. I mean, we have federal and state levels of antitrust enforcement, and both, of the enforcement bodies are trying to figure out, will these new arrangements improve quality? Will they improve bargaining power? And all of these pieces are so hard. And I think that we are now kind of looking to it as like the magic bullet to control prices, and I'm pretty skeptical that this area of analysis is going to get us there.
Well, this leads us to some interesting regulatory design questions that the Supreme Court has actually touched on recently about overlapping and conflicting areas of jurisdiction among federal agencies and between federal and state levels of regulation. So with the FTC now getting probably increasing its involvement in healthcare over the next sort of short run, what will that do in terms of any conflict that arises between HHS and FTC in terms of best approaches to regulating this question? And there's some shady law on that question of overlapping jurisdictions among agencies that is going to become more important, I think.
You really see this in a number of different industries. So, Allison, you mentioned hospitals getting bigger, and then the insurers feel like they need to get bigger, and the drug companies feel like they need to get bigger in order to kind of maintain the balance of power. Similarly, in another industry, cable companies are getting bigger, and now the question is, do the media companies need to get bigger in order to combat that changing power dynamic? So it's interesting to see these arms races develop. Thank you, Michael. Rachel.
So thank you all for this wonderful panel. When you began talking about different barriers to reform, you mostly discussed political barriers, maybe scientific or evidence barriers, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more explicitly about legal barriers and what we as lawyers and law professors might do. So one example I'll give is that in drug pricing, which is an area I think a lot about, the pharmaceutical companies have expressed concern that the Medicaid best price rule is preventing them from offering certain kinds of value-based contracts to big private insurers. And so we can start thinking about whether that's true. If so, how we might craft exceptions or fix the rules such that it wouldn't stand in the way of innovations like that. So I'm wondering if you all have thoughts about this, or if you really do think it's political and evidence-based.
When I was a fellow here, there was a great workshop. I don't know if you remember this, when Atul Gawande came to speak.
Oh, wow.
And he was kind of laying out a vision of what healthcare delivery needs to look like. And then he looked at the audience and said, well, what are the legal barriers to making this happen? And I think that you were the only person on the faculty at that talk who had healthcare expertise. And there was not a resounding chorus of these are all the legal barriers in answer to his question. But that was it was the right question to be asking at that time, because we've seen as ACOs and kind of this vision that he was laying and rolled out, that there were so many legal barriers in ways that state corporate practice of medicine doctrine and laws about anti-kickbacks and dollars for referrals in healthcare. And I think everywhere you turn in healthcare, Einar mentioned earlier as part of Medicare, Part D, there's a provision that says that the government can't negotiate drug prices. Huge barrier to thinking about solving a problem in this area. I mean, that's the wonderful news for us, is that there are so many unintended consequences in the law to think about and write about.
Well, yeah. and there's so much that there are so many barriers that come from just the historical accidents that have affected healthcare, right? I mean, like ERISA preemption of insurance regulations, and we just saw a Supreme Court opinion on this that's going to get in the way of increasing the evidence base, and and ERISA preemption was not a thoughtful choice about how to regulate or manage the healthcare sector at all, right? I mean, it's about pensions. So many, I think it's just tons of examples of things like that where government has done something that has impacted the healthcare sector without thinking through what the consequences were going to be, and has led to lots of perverse consequences. And is that a barrier to reform? It's a barrier to innovative reform from the bottom up. It's not a barrier to reform from the top down, because what's needed in order to fix it is reform from the top down, right? So, it's a need for reform more than a barrier to reform, but it's a barrier to market-based and state-based solutions to some of the problems we see.
But I think it's a very interesting problem, and it's sort of the flip side of the not being able to bargain about it. You're right, and Rachel's own work has been pioneering in this area, but that Medicaid, sometimes you want to give them discretion to pay more, not less. So it's all trying to constrain their budget by saying, they have to get these rebates and charge less. But if you need drugs for a population, and you can actually save healthcare costs by encouraging them, you may actually want to pay more rather than less for the drug. So I think generally it would be nice if the system moved away from sort of regulatory kind of on-off sort of mandates and more towards discretion vested in groups that have a goal to maximize and the incentives to maximize it. And so I think this is one example.
Well, on behalf of the...
I'm going to ask one more question. Organizer's privilege, which is just to get the panel to, in the couple of minutes remaining, to say a few words about the role of the medical profession itself in advocating and lobbying for health reform, both from an ethical perspective and also, from their role as providers getting paid to, do these services. That's something that hasn't been touched on very much, and it seems to be a very powerful group.
Well, I can say in our work, again, we are now in the process. I mentioned the class action lawsuit. We're also developing a series of Office of Civil Rights complaints for the ways in which the marketplace is not being managed and the discriminatory insurance practices. You mentioned one, this idea, for example, of placing every single HIV med for every single insurance plan within a particular zip code on 50% coinsurance. And that's from the first oldest line medication to the newest line med across the board, 50% coinsurance. Or excluding, for example, every single tablet regimen from the formula, which is the drug that transforms HIV because it's one pill per day. And I would just say that it is only our ability to work closely with the medical community that ends up ultimately being our expert witnesses and gives us the information that we have that really makes it possible for us to do both the administrative regulatory side of the work, because we always try to work with government on this before we ultimately sue them if we have to. And then they also obviously help us on that other side. So those are just a couple of examples of the kinds of ways that we are in close communication and working closely with the medical community every day in our work.
I think the medical profession and groups do a lot of sort of heroic things in terms of figuring out ways to lower cost and improve quality. I think the trouble is too often we're in a system where we actually penalize them for it. So Duke Medical School with a big program once figured out a way to monitor people with congestive heart failure in a way that made the outcomes much better and reduced costs by 40%. And the reward was their revenue went down by 40%. And Atul Gawande had a similar thing going on here at Harvard. So we need to give a system that actually rewards the medical profession when it does these sorts of interventions, rather than relying too much on heroism over incentives, I think.
And the work that the Petrie Flom Center has done here with the Harvard network of hospitals and Harvard Medical School, just wonder if you could comment on some of that collaboration that's taken place over the last decade.
Well, there's been a lot of joint conferences and people getting together and joint papers. And really, we just started it in but I think Holly and Glenn have actually taken it to a much higher level since I left the center. But it does seem there's enormous resources here at Harvard, so many different institutions. And when we started out, it took us, I think, a year or two to find them all. They're all sort of siloed, but now there's common websites and common ways of interacting and retreats and things. So I think that has been a huge step forward.
Well, on behalf of the Petrie Flom Center, please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists, Robert, Abby, Einar, and Allison. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too.